Welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin.
Hello and welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin. Dan is a board-certified attorney in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with over 25 years of experience. He boasts many accolades in the field of Michigan criminal defense and has earned the highest peer ranking available for legal ethics and ability. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is From P. Diddy to R. Kelly, Litigating Sex Crime Cases. Dan, great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kevin. I appreciate it.
All right, so a case all over the national news this year is the case against music mogul Sean P. Diddy Combs in New York. He is just the latest in a string of celebrities charged with a sex crime allegation. We had R. Kelly, Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby. You have a unique perspective as a former prosecutor, a criminal defense attorney, and a board-certified criminal trial attorney. What can you tell us about the onslaught of sex crime cases?
Oh boy, that's a great word, Kevin, onslaught, because it sure seems like there has been one lately, right?
Yeah.
I mean, every time you open the paper or you look on TV or you watch the news, there's another celebrity or sports star or somebody charged with a sex crime, including all of those you mentioned most topically now. I'm not so sure necessarily if it's an onslaught of more sex crimes offenses occurring, or rather whether more cases are being charged. But certainly there's high media attention to these cases. Certainly there's high stakes on both sides to these cases. And certainly there's a lot of intrigue by the public, especially when celebrities or sports stars are involved.
Sure.
So you used a great word, onslaught. From my perspective as an attorney in the criminal justice field, we're seeing a lot of sex crimes allegations. Obviously, that umbrella has a lot of different types of offenses in it. And certainly it seems as though these cases have increased in their volume over the past several years.
It seems like a lot of them are like trafficking and kind of big, like vast offenses. Is that something that is just coming to light more these days, you think?
I think that's probably true, especially with some of the celebrities, like you mentioned, P. Diddy or Puff Daddy or whatever he's going by these days. You see a lot of the trafficking elements there. And that is a relatively new term as it relates to justice. It's a relatively new charge as it relates to many states. And primarily that is a federal offense. And so you're getting the United States government involved when someone's trafficking, especially if people are crossing state lines and so forth. I will say for my practice and for most of my peers who practice in the justice system, we don't see a lot of trafficking cases, thank God. But I would say that it does seem in the celebrity cases to be more of a prevalent issue.
Yeah, for sure. How have sex crime cases changed over the years since you started practicing, 27 years ago?
Yeah, there's no doubt. And for me, one of the big seminal moments or seminal issues of change was probably the MeToo movement, because in 2017, you saw more and more people comfortable in coming forward with allegations of sex crimes or anything in that umbrella, as I said before. And not only did you have more people comfortable in coming forward, I think you had a recognition by law enforcement, prosecutors, judges that, more and more people were to be believed, believe the accuser, believe the survivors, that type of mantra. And that did result in more cases and has resulted in more cases. Now, I always say we need to be sort of careful with that, because I can tell you, just as anyone in the justice system can, there are still cases where people exaggerate, where people lie, where people are looking for an advantage in, say, a civil suit or a custody arrangement or something. And so we can't just knee-jerk reaction say, believe the accusers. But all of that is to say, to me, the Me Too movement brought a higher volume, higher scrutiny to these cases. But there's been other seismic shifts since I began, even with things like DNA and scientific testing, easier for the prosecution to prove these cases. And then you have media, not only the media attention on these offenses, which seems to have increased, but social media, what people are posting about an alleged offense and whether those posts can be used against them, and just electronic media to begin with. For example, sometimes people film others doing bad things. Say someone gropes someone in a bar, there's often cell camera video to it too. So to me, there's been a seismic change with the Me Too movement, and then there's been gradual changes with the things I mentioned to really sort of, I would say, alter the way in which sex crimes are both defended and litigated in the courtroom.
Yeah, social media, you bring up a good point. I remember years ago, my favorite hockey player was accused of a sexual assault, and you read social media, and he was guilty, immediately guilty. And as it turned out, once things unfolded, it was a lie. And so we have to be very careful with what we read on social media. I know that's not exactly a hot take, but we got to be careful what we read on social media before we get too judgy.
Kevin, you're exactly right. I mean, you cite a hockey player. I think the case I could cite that everyone has familiarity with is the Duke lacrosse case, which is now almost 20 years old. But, those young men were tried and convicted long before they were charged. And ultimately, it proved to be untrue. The district attorney who brought the charges was disbarred. So we always have to be careful in making assumptions, especially what people are putting on social media.
Yeah, that's a very good example as well. Ruin those kids' lives, and for then they didn't do anything.
No question.
Yeah. So in Michigan particularly, what are some of the more common sex crime offenses that you see?
So in Michigan, sex crimes are largely grouped under the acronym CSC, which stands for criminal sexual conduct. We have degrees of CSC: first, second, third, and fourth. Strangely, first and third are the worst, and then second and fourth. There's no real logical order to that. In a nutshell, first and third degrees involve penetration of some sort with then some aggravating illegal factor, and there's many differences between those, whereas second and fourth degree are touching without penetration with some aggravating or illegal variable to accompany that. Now, when you ask about most common, so most of these offenses are going to be sort of in that date rape category, especially when you practice, as I do, in a college town. A lot of date rape and alcohol-related offenses, and now controlled substance offenses where perhaps consent was equivocal or unequivocal, depending on a person's perspective. So I would say the grand majority of cases are CSC, are in that date rape or alcohol-related category. And then if you use your example about some of these celebrities, you're seeing more and more sex trafficking. You're seeing more and more, unfortunately, children victim cases. You're seeing more and more forcible incidents where people do not have consent to begin with. But from my practice, generally talking about CSC, alcohol, drugs, and in some cases, what people refer to as date rape allegations.
Okay. And what are the consequences of a conviction of some of these crimes?
Oh boy. So I always talk about direct consequences. What do I tell John Doe if he's a client? He's going to get, if he's convicted of a CSC, he's likely going to lose his freedom. Virtually every CSC offense in Michigan is a felony. Virtually every judge in this state will highly consider incarceration on a conviction. And in fact, sometimes it is mandatory, and we're talking state prison or at the very least a long time in a local jail. So that's the direct consequence. You're going to lose your freedom if you're convicted, plus pay fines and be on probation and so forth. We always have to remember the collateral consequences. And the big one for sex crimes is a sex offender registry. So the grand majority, if not 98%, of CSC offenses in Michigan are going to put people on a public sex offender registry, what we call SORA, if they are convicted, where they have to register and the public can see their names and their offenses and their address and so forth to protect other people in the community. This sometimes is heavy-handed in who it puts on the list. There's been a lot of litigation on SORA in Michigan, but that is to say that is the biggest collateral consequence. And then we're talking about loss of certain freedoms to own weapons, loss of the ability to travel, loss of the ability to vote, loss of the ability to, in some instances, get certain jobs, live in certain areas. So a laundry list of collateral consequences and very serious direct consequences of a CSC conviction.
Yeah, no doubt. Tell us about some of the more memorable sex crime cases you've handled over your career.
That's an interesting question. One of the ones that stands out to me, and I don't think I'll ever forget it, is, and Jesus, must be 15 years ago at this point, but I represented an 8-year-old girl, if you can believe that, who was charged here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with criminal sexual conduct for largely what people referred to in our days growing up as playing doctor with a younger cousin or nephew. And the prosecutor's office charged this 8-year-old girl, who would walk into court all of 3 feet tall and 50 pounds or whatever she was, visibly scared and shaking as she approached a courtroom and a judge. As you can imagine, we filed some motions to get her case dismissed on what's called age competency, and thankfully we were successful. But I always think about that in terms of memorable and the power of government and the power of prosecutors to really change and in some instances upend lives with their charging decisions, especially in CSC cases. And then I've got a host of, frankly, young people, college students who come to college on that first or second week. There no supervision. There's alcohol. They're out of the house for the first time. And when there's sexual encounters, you can imagine lots of things can go wrong. And I think of some of the students I've represented who have either defeated the cases, and rightfully so, and they reach out to me years later to tell me how great their lives are going and thank me for getting them out of that. And then think about the people who ruined their lives over one really foolish act and are now on public registries and can't get jobs in their careers. So those are some of the more memorable cases as it sticks in my mind.
Yeah, wow. I didn't even know you could do that with, I could have an 8-year-old girl be prosecuted for something like that.
It's a great question, and I'll summarize it by saying there's really no age minimum on which a prosecution can charge, but a person does have to have competency, and if they don't understand the proceedings due to age, if they can't meaningfully assist, as this young person could not, then judges will often intervene and dismiss the charges.
Okay, got it. You handle a lot of juvenile cases and college-age defense, as you said. Do you find, is it getting better on campus? Is it getting worse? As we get more, I don't know, there's more awareness, there's more education, there's more people to talk to. Do you find that it's getting any better?
That's a really good question. I'm here in a town with 50,000 undergrads, and we have two major universities within an hour. So you probably have 100 undergrads, each year. And as you said, and as I said, you combine alcohol and freedom and mistakes and immaturity, and that does result in a lot of CSC allegations. But I think to your question, I think that people are getting better educated when they get to campus on consent and what that means and how it needs to be very clear. So I do think that there's been a real education, but that hasn't stopped the volume, not only of criminal sexual conduct cases against students, against juveniles, but also the corollary Title IX cases that are brought on campus. These are discipline allegations brought against students for what is often sex crimes, sexual harassment, and touching. I wrote a book long ago. It's on our website, Defending College Students Charged with Sex Crimes. And I don't say this to pawn the book. It's not for sale. But the reason I say that is there's a lot of cases out there. There's a lot of unknowns out there. And it is still, unfortunately, a very big practice area. And I'm guessing that's the same in any college campus throughout the United States.
Yeah, that's very unique to be where you are for things like that. Because to your point that you made several times, alcohol and immaturity tend to not go well together.
There's no doubt about that. Yeah. And that tends to show up in the volume of cases that we see every year, and specifically every September.
Are polygraph examinations used in sex crime cases?
They are, which is, it sort of stumps the public when I tell them that, or I have clients in and we talk about polygraph. To be clear, a polygraph is, for lack of a better word, a lie detector test, a deception test. And strangely enough, criminal sexual conduct is the only law on Michigan's books that mentions the word polygraph. It says a person charged with criminal sexual conduct or sex crime, or even investigated, has a right to a polygraph. Now, it doesn't say what that means. It doesn't say what happens if a person passes. It just says you have a right to one. And in my experience, law enforcement puts a lot of stock in a polygraph exam on a sex crime. So does prosecuting attorneys' offices. It generally means if someone passes a polygraph on a very specific fact pattern. For example, that person had a knife and held me down, and they passed a polygraph that they never had a knife. That will cause grave concern for the police and prosecutors, and often will result in a dismissal or denial or reduction in charges. Now, there's no bright line rule on that, Kevin. The polygraphs are used as a tool. They're generally not admissible in court, but investigative tool, no doubt, in these types of crimes.
Yeah, I've often thought, if I just sat down right now and took a polygraph in general, it'd be hard. You kind of get nervous, right? I think it was Meet the Parents had that in the movie, where it's nerve-wracking to be hooked up to a machine, I would imagine.
Our first ever Greg Fokker reference in these podcasts, but you're 100% right. Fokker's nervous, you'd be nervous, I'd be nervous. And imagine you have the weight of a capital offense held over your head, especially if you're not guilty of it. It's a very difficult process. And people that do well on polygraphs generally, of course, are telling the truth and can somehow put that anxiety and fear behind them and focus on what did and did not happen.
So what is your general approach to actually trying sex crime cases once you get, if you get in front of a jury?
So, like any trial, whether it's drunk driving, it's homicide, it's criminal sexual conduct, I think lawyers, especially young lawyers, have to remember you have to have a good theory of your case. What is your theory? That working theory will tell you virtually everything you need to know to answer your question. If the theory is this didn't happen, the person is lying, then you're doing everything you can to convince the judge or jury about credibility and the lies and do an investigation on that area. If, on the other hand, it's about consent, you're doing everything you can to establish your own client's credibility or the credibility of your side. But bigger picture to your question, you have to make sure you have the right jury picked. You have to remove jurors that might have an implicit bias, or maybe they have family members that have had this type of case or been victimized. You also have to use experts effectively. If it's a case involving a child witness, you might want to have a psychologist or an expert in child protocol interviewing on your witness list. You might have to rely on DNA evidence and DNA witnesses, and you have to be able to effectively cross-examine the experts on the other side. And last but not least, you have to be able to demonstrate to the jury a story, for lack of a better words, that makes sense to them. You have to put them essentially in your client's shoes so that they can get to the point of hopefully reaching the right, just verdict in the trial.
Wow. Okay. So it's obviously a very intense process. How long does a case like this or a trial like this generally last?
You know, you see in the news, some of these trials lasting weeks and months, and that's generally not the reality of everyday justice for attorneys like me. Most trials last days, not weeks. Most judges are pretty efficient with getting trials up and going. I would say on average, a criminal sexual conduct trial might last 2 to 3 days, but boy, are you right about the stakes. You talk about the highest level emotion cases on both sides. They tend to be, of course, murders and things like that. And then second on that list, but not far behind, criminal sexual conduct, because you have a victim and a victim's family or complaining witness's family. You have a defendant and all of their family, and it's often very high stakes, very high emotion, very high stress for both sides.
Bringing it back to the beginning of the show, what do you think is going to happen next in the P. Diddy case?
Well, like a lot of the celebrity cases, at least over the last couple of years, they tend to totem pole and build. And what happens is more and more complainants or victims come forward. And that becomes almost impossible to defend. You're basically plugging holes left and right if you're him or his defense counsel. And it becomes almost to the point of overwhelming. To me, from what I have seen, I think he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. But let's never forget the celebrity factor, Kevin. Celebrities in justice, they don't always end up like the common person. But it sure seems like the evidence is overwhelming against him, as it has been against many of these celebrities, at least since 2017 in the MeToo movement.
Yeah, definitely. Without a doubt. All right. Well, thank you for joining us on Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin. To connect with Dan, head to glgmichigan.com. And please be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and give us a review if you enjoyed the episode. Dan, it was great chatting with you. Looking forward to the next one.
You too, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.